we were hearing the radio, and in the news it came that Stalin died. The radio said, what a pity, and what will be with us without Stalin. And at the end of the news, my father said, one communist less.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Good evening. The stunning overthrow of Mikhail Gorbachev by communist hardliners dominates the news this Monday. Gorbachev was reported under house arrest as Soviet tanks took up positions throughout Moscow.
5, 4, 7, 1, 6, 9, 8, 3.
Poland's military leader, General Jaruzelski, urged the Polish people tonight not to demonstrate on Tuesday, the second anniversary of the founding of the banned trade union Solidarity.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
László Nagy was one of the early members of the Hungarian Democratic Forum in 1987. The HDF became Hungary's largest political party following the first free elections in Hungary in 1990. In this episode we hear the story of László's parents' life in 1950s Hungary and László's early life, including how he ended up at school with the son of West Germany's president. Before we start, I'd like to ask you to leave a review in iTunes or with your favourite podcast provider. It really does help us get new guests on the show and spread the word. If you'd like to assist us further with the costs of running the show, then head over to coldwarconversations.com and click on the Support the Podcast menu option to learn more. Thank you so much to all our fans that are supporting us financially. It is really appreciated. Now, back to today's episode. We start with László describing his father's experiences at the end of World War II.
You know, my father was a geodet, a land surveyor, an engineer, and he studied in this city where we live now, in Sopron. He was born somewhere else, but that's why we live in this city, because he fell in love with the city, and he said once in his life he will come back to Sopron. And really, he came back, and but he graduated in 1944, and you know, it was wartime.
Yeah.
And all the students who graduated were recruited in the army. And fortunately, they were not captured here in Hungary, and they also didn't have to fight. They were not in war. They were actually on training. So officially, they didn't get any, they were not sergeants or something. They were simple soldiers. And in Germany, in Bavaria, they were in May, 45, when the war ended. So they were very lucky. After half a year, he could come home because there was no transport, the war was terrible. And for this half year, they were working, they were free people because they were POWs, but only for 3 days. After they were freed, and they worked in Munich, building, reconstructing their air base. There was an airport which was completely bombed down, and they were working there. After half a year, he came home. But the Russian soldiers were here, the Soviets were here, and his father said he should be very careful because the communists were already ruling the country. And they were very suspicious if somebody came back from West who were POWs. They thought they are spies of the Americans or so on. And it was not so, my father was my grandfather was a rich person. He had a business in Szombathely. This is a city 70 kilometers south of Sopron, where we live now. that was not a good passport, at that time. My grandfather told him, they will call you to the police, you have to go in and you have to write a CV.
A CV, yeah.
Yeah, write in the CV that your father is a worker and your mother is a peasant woman, a farmer woman, and such things. So not the truth. They have no time to control it, but learn exactly what you wrote, because next week they will call you again, and then again a week later, and you have to write it again, and then they checked, if he wrote the same. And he was really, really invited to the police. They said, write your CV, your life. He wrote his father is a worker, the mother is a farmer, peasant woman, etc. Next week he had to go again, third time again, and after finished, because he always wrote the same thing, he didn't have to go again, and he was not checked somehow, and he was not suspicious, he was very, very lucky, because he got a job just on the Romanian-Hungarian border in a forest, because he was a forest engineer, first. Later he became a land surveyor, and that was good because it was very far from everything, very far from big cities, and you were not in front of their eyes, That's why it was a very safe place. He had a lot of friends there, doctors and such intelligent from the intelligence, who went there to disappear from, to be in front of the eyes of the communists, because, the old ruling class, the intelligence of the times before the war, they were suspicious and they got problems. So he had a quite good life there. Then in 1948, he married my mother. And in 1949, my sister, my first sister, I have two sisters, was born. It's a very funny story, because she was born on the 21st of December. That's the birthday of Stalin.
I didn't know that.
And we always make a joke with my sister when she has the birthday. And my father, he was a young man. This was the first baby. He had to run on horse. He was riding to take the doctor. And he forgot that he should have gone to Debrecen, to a big city, because in the company for which he was working, there was a big celebration. Birthday of Stalin was a big celebration. He was the only one who didn't appear. And, they controlled it. Next day, he had to go to the center. He didn't know why. He forgot all this,
Yeah. Well, you would.
And there was a commission sitting at a table, and they asked him that, where have you been yesterday? Then, then he remembered Stalin had birthday, and he said, oh, look, I had to run. I was riding on horse to get a doctor because my daughter was born yesterday. And he saw that the people became delighted and happy because they didn't want to do any harm to him, and they were happy to say that, oh, let us congratulate you because your daughter is born on the same day as Stalin, and that's fantastic. My father was not happy about it because he didn't like Stalin, but that's why he didn't get any punishment. Otherwise, there would have been a punishment. 1949, it was already, we had very hard times in Hungary. And then later he got another job at the same company, of course. But it was usual that these young engineers they left them to work somewhere 3 years or 2 years, and they had to go somewhere else. I don't know why, and of course they knew that he's a conservative. They knew that he's a religious man going to church every Sunday, that he's not a communist. And, that was, he had a black label, so to say. And once, it was in 1951 or so, he got a job. He should have gone to Calabria. Calabria is a city just at the Yugoslavian border. And this was, I think, in 1955, when there was a big problem. Tito got problems with Moscow, with Khrushchev, and also Hungary. We almost had war with Yugoslavia, and there were problems on the border. The soldiers, the border guards were shooting each other. Sometimes there was some smaller battles, and my father didn't know that. But fortunately, he met a friend of him on the street in Debrecen, in the city, where just after he got his papers that he has to go to Calabria. And he said, "Oh, don't go there, because already 10 forestry engineers died already in the shootings, And he said, they send you there because that's almost an execution. That's a death sentence." Unfortunately, somehow my father could say no, and he was not sent to Calabria. It was a very, very, very difficult time. And then came 1956. Just in 1956, he could get a job in Szombathely, in the city where he was born. And later, in 1957, I was born also there. And he was very happy because the family was there, and the relatives. Also, the family of my mother lived in Szombathely. And just when the revolution broke out, in these days, they were traveling to Szombathely from Eastern Hungary, which was not easy. There were 2 small children, my 2 sisters, and just the taxi drivers wanted to go on strike, and my father would convince one of the taxi drivers to make a last turn from one station to the other, because they had to go in Budapest from one railway station to another one. This was, I think, the 4th or 5th of November, because the Russians were already in. And my sisters told me they still remember that they were watching out through the back windows of the taxi, and the Russian tank came behind the taxi.
Wow. So this is the time of the Hungarian uprising of 1956.
Yes, 1956. And then in these days, my father met his friends, who were most of them school friends from the university of that time, but they were already professors and assistants and so on at the university, some of them, because they stayed in the University of Sopron. And they convinced him to go with them to emigrate to Canada. It's an interesting story. Maybe, I'm sure you don't know about it, but it's interesting that this forestry university in Sopron emigrated totally. All the professors and the students went to Canada.
Right, and this was 1956.
1956 November, and and Canada created in Vancouver a Hungarian university, forestry university, and they were teaching there in Hungarian. So all the students could finish the university and graduate from Vancouver, learning in Hungarian language, because of course the professors were also Hungarians. But this university is still existing and working, of course, now in English.
Yeah.
My father would have been teacher there, a professor there with with his other friends, but he couldn't go because, my mother was already pregnant with me, and the doctor said there's a problem, and there was really a problem. One doctor said there must be made an abortion because I have a problem. One doctor said I am already dead. And my father said, no, this child is okay. And he found a doctor who gave a lot of injections for my mother. But he said now, it was a very cold autumn, very cold winter, 1956 in Hungary. He said, you cannot go. You cannot emigrate. And so we stayed in Hungary.
So it's down to you that your family stayed in Hungary.
Yes, I was the reason why we didn't emigrate. And we are not so sorry about it, because our life was maybe harder, but more interesting than it would have been in Canada.
Yeah. How difficult was it to leave Hungary at that time?
It was difficult because in the first days when the Russians came in, it was easier according to security, because there was no border guard on the border. They were not guarding the border, but there were no cars, lorries or so, or just a few. It was not possible to take a train or to take a bus or something. So most of the people came somehow near to the border with train, or because inside in the country, of course, there was transport, but they had to go over to Austria by feet.
Right.
And of course, you had to know the way. You had to know how to use a map. Okay, my father was a specialist for that. It was not, but it was cold. There was snow. You can see the archive films. There are a lot from filmed on the Austrian border. The bridge of Andau is very, very famous. That was a bridge where many Hungarians went through between two small villages to Austria, but you had to walk and kilometers, and with babies and pregnant women, sickness, what we had, my mother and me, it was impossible. It would have been very, very dangerous. And that's why, about 250,000 people left Hungary, and most of them had to go through the border, walking by feet in cold times, in snow, so it was not easy. I found a newspaper from the 50s, from the time when Stalin died, and I read it. This was in the 80s, and I read that, of course, officially the people had to mourn Stalin, and the people were crying, and for 5 minutes everybody had to stop. You can see in archive films that in Budapest, for example, there was a siren sound, and the people were standing, not moving. On the trams, the buses, the taxis, the cars, everything stopped. Of course, it was controlled. The police was outside. And I read in this newspaper that the Hungarians were crying, all the 10 million. And then I asked my mother, how was it? This was, March 1953. And she said, your father was preparing himself in the morning to go to work. And we were hearing the radio, and in the news it came that Stalin died. And of course, the radio said, what a pity, and what will be with us without Stalin. And at the end of the news, my father said, one communist less. But he was not crying. That was his reaction, at least one communist less.
So in 1960, I think your family moved to Sopron, didn't they?
Yes. After 3 years, when I was 3 years old, we left Szombathely, and I remember only two things, but it's a joke. I used to say that my first, the first thing which I remember from my life, and this is true, was that we lived in a house, it was a small house, 3 or 4 families were living there. It's in the middle of the city, and there was a small garden. And one of the families who were living there had a pig, and they kept him in the garden. And the pig was a black pig, and the name was Kádár. Exactly the name as János Kádár, the dictator, who was the general secretary of the party, who became, by the Russians, he was put there in 1956. And I still don't know, my mother cannot also say that, because, in 1960, to give the name Kádár for a black pig, so the person who was very, very brave, or he was working for the Secret Service, and that was a provocation.
Yeah.
My mother doesn't know that, but there are two possibilities. And, we went down with my sister to the garden, and I had a piece of bread in my hand. And the pig realized, I was only 3 years old, and the pig realized the bread, and he was running to me. He wanted to pinch it. He wanted to take it from my hand. And, a 3 years old child has a very small hand. He could have chopped my hand together with the bread. And my sister was fortunately very fast and clever. And we were running in the staircase, the stair house, and she banged the door. And I remember we were standing there, we didn't get air. And later I thought, that maybe I only remember because they told me this story. And I was already a university student, and I went back to this house in Szombathely. I was not there since then. And I realized that the picture which I saw, this gate, this door, there were, colored glasses in it. And I remember still clearly till now, of course, because it was an extreme situation. And then I saw that really, I remember well, and it was not just told me, because I remember these colors. So, and then I spoke also with a doctor, a neurologist, and he said that with the age of 3, you can remember things already if you had an extreme situation, for example, a danger like in this time. But I used to tell this story because I used to say that, look, I was already chased politically. I was attacked by János Kádár when I was 3 years old. Of course, it's a joke, but the pig was called Kádár. That's true. The rest is not true.
So, what were your school days like?
Well, my school days started in 1964, I think, yes, in Sopron, and I went to the same primary school where my sisters also studied. And, first years were boring for me, and I also had problem with the school teacher because, I had 2 sisters, and what the 2 sisters, what they can play with the boy. They couldn't play football, so they played always school. So we played at home always school. They were the teachers, and I was the student. And, when I was 5 years old, I could read and write and use numbers and counting like somebody who is the second class or first class in going to the first class or second class in the primary school.
Yeah.
And that was dangerous because, it's not, but they were good teachers because I didn't have problem about it. I only had a problem with my teacher that because I was, they started with A and then B and C, how it is starting at the school. And it was boring for me. And I was not ready to make that, to do that exercises which she asked for as the others, because I already knew that. I was reading books, when I was 5. And somehow she didn't understand it, that's the problem. And for the first 2-3 years, we had a lot of conflicts. My luck was that the fifth, in the 5th year in Hungary, it was the system was so that in the first 4 years, we had almost only one teacher. And this teacher was teaching mathematics and all the other things, reading, writing, grammatics, so on. And at the 5th class, we got a lot of teachers. And, new subjects came like history, geography, and so on. And then my sisters were already looking after the boys, not playing with me school. So these things were new for me. And I liked it. I liked geography. I liked history very much. And school started to interest me. And I was a bad student in the first 3-4 years, because I had these conflicts with this teacher, and she punished me always that I got bad marks. And in the class 5, the whole class was amazed, and a little bit also me, that I was the only one in the class who got the best marks from every subject, because it was interesting me very much. And from that time on, I liked school. Before, I didn't like it.
Right.
So these were the first 5 years.
And did you have to join the Young Pioneers or any of the communist organizations?
Yes, of course. There was first day, there was the small drummers in English, the Kisdobos in Hungarian, that was under the 5 class in the first 4, and we had to wear, when there was something, a blue tie. And the pioneers, after the class 5, I think, as far as I remember, we had to wear a red tie. And it was very interesting for me. And now I will jump in time very much, because in every school there was a teacher who was in charge for this pioneers movement. And our physical education teacher was in charge. And when, and now I jump in time, in 1990, when we start, 1988, I'm sorry, I joined here in Sopron. Later we will speak about it, the Hungarian Democratic Forum. I founded it with 5 friends of mine. This was the first oppositional organization in the city. We had some events, so that we invited the people of Sopron. We rented in the cultural house a big room, and we were speaking about politics, and many people came. And then I saw him, our physical education teacher, and he was one of the hardest anti-communists in these times. And I met him. He was very happy because he remembered me. And he told me that he hated this pioneer movement. And, the director called him and he said, look, you will be in charge for the pioneers. And, you couldn't say no, because, of course, you could have said no. But then they would have thrown you out from the school, or they would have you would have to go to the police station for hearing, or, there were a lot of things which were inconvenient. And, he said he was biting his mouth and he did it because he had to. But in his heart, he was an anti-communist, and we didn't know that.
No. Wow. And did you have to learn Marxism and Leninism in class?
That was later, because, for these children in the primary school, we didn't have to learn such things because we were too small for that. In that time, we had to read stories of pioneer heroes from the Soviet Union, which we later learned that they were not true. They were stories which were just written by people who were ordered to write such things. And they were stories how heroic the pioneers were fighting against the Germans in the war, how they were helping the partisans and such things. This we had to read, but real politics that came later in the secondary school. But in Hungary, I was not attending secondary school, because when I was in class 8, just before the secondary school starts in Hungary with class 9. Then my father was sent as expatriate to Africa, to Nigeria. This is also an interesting story. And I finished my secondary schools in Nigeria and later in Germany. And I came back in 1975 to Hungary when I became a soldier, because I joined the Technical University of Budapest. I studied chemistry, but at that time it was so that if you were a student, before joining the university, you had to go to the army for 11 months. And I came from a West German boarding school, one of the most well-known and very expensive. I don't know how my father could pay it. Boarding school where even the son of the head of state of Germany, he was my schoolmate, my classmate, Andreas von Weizsäcker. And from there, directly, I came in the Communist Army of Hungary. So it was a big change, a very big change. So my life was not easy.
That's an amazing story. Can I just go back? I mean, I would have thought it's unusual for somebody who's not a member of the Communist Party to be given a job in Africa.
Yes.
Why was that?
We were very, very lucky, extremely lucky, because, I could thank a lot for this, because I learned English, first of all, because first I went to an English school, and for 1 year, because, Nigeria was an English colony. And then I joined a German school, because there was a very good German school. So I learned German in Nigeria. And of course, for me to go to another country, another continent, another culture, and to learn languages in such young years, it was a gift, a present, But our luck was that the company, everything was nationalized in Hungary and centralized. And my father was working at a state-owned land surveying company, but there was only one. Because Hungary is a small country, and, everything was centralized. So many things were centralized in one company. And, land surveyors, you don't need so many. Of course, there are a few hundred. I don't know how many they were. I think there were 800 people who were working in this company. And there was no other company. And there was a contract. This was organized by... that time the companies couldn't have direct contact abroad. So the Hungarian companies, for example, a factory could export, of course, goods to Western countries, but not directly, always through a trade company. They were state-owned trade companies, which were later, as we learned after 1999, they were part of the secret services,
Mm-hmm.
And because they had contacts with the Western companies, and because they were traveling a lot, many of them were agents, not all of them, but many of them. And only these companies were allowed to sign contracts with companies abroad, also East and West. And one of these trading companies, export companies, were specialized for the field of intelligence. So selling under intelligence, I don't understand secret things, but they were selling how to say, they made, for example, in Nigeria, in our case, they made a joint venture with a Nigerian company, a Nigerian land survey company, and they needed engineers, and they needed somebody who would be the technical director, who would organize the company. And this was my father. But why? Because he was the only person in the company who spoke English. And this was our luck. He had a very good friend. He was a very good guy. He just died last year here in Sopron. And he was a party member. But he liked my father very much. They were good friends. And he told me that there was a meeting of the party members. It was always every second week, or I don't know, there was a meeting. And he told my father that somebody stood up and asked the party secretary of the company that why my father will be sent to Nigeria, because he's not a communist, he's not a party member, and he's religious, And every Sunday they are in the church, the family. And why they don't send the communists? And imagine the party secretary said that there were 3 criteria regarding this job. They needed somebody who is a very good organizer, who is a very good skilled engineer, and who speaks fluently English. Unfortunately, there is only one in the person in the company like that, and everybody knew that, of course, and that's my father. And he said that if there would have been one person in the Communist Party who would speak English, they would have sent him, but there was no other choice. And this was our luck. Imagine there would have been only one communist speaking English. We wouldn't speak now.
No. How did your father learn English?
Because my father was a workaholic. Yeah? He was working instead of 3 persons. So he worked for this company, which had a department in Sopron here, because the company was, of course, in Budapest, a central company. But there was a department in Sopron, and there was a department in Győr, 90 kilometers from away from Sopron. And he worked in Sopron, but to earn more money, and he was asked also, because he was a very skilled person, to be the leader of the department in Győr, but he should work also in Sopron. So 3 or 4 days a week, he went every morning with the train to Győr and came back in the evening, which was 1.5 hours, almost 2 hours. So he woke up very early, and he was 1.5 hours or maybe 2 hours, I don't know, because that time the train was very slow, although it's only 90 kilometers. And my father was a person who would have been bored to sit 2 hours on the train. And he bought an English lesson book. It was, I remember it, the name was Essential English. It had 4 bands. And that time, I think that was the best English language book which you could buy. And he was learning in the train, but without teacher. But almost 4 hours a day. And he learned English very well. And he found somebody in Sopron, an old man who lived for decades in the USA. And he came back to Hungary after retirement. And he, on weekends, when he was here in Sopron, for a few hours, he went to this person and he paid for him. And they were talking. So he could speak English and he could learn the pronunciation. That's why he had an American pronunciation. And this is the way how he learned English. And we didn't know, we always said, but why you do that? It's a lot of, it's very, very hard to learn without teacher and working so much English. He said, sometimes it will be good for me. And he was right.
Absolutely right. Wow. So how long were you in Nigeria for?
My father left Hungary March 1970, and he stayed 7 years, which is also an interesting story, because it was not a law. It was not written anywhere, but it was usual that after 5 years, everybody had to go back to Hungary. And even the ambassadors, they always changed everybody. But because there was nobody who could go to Nigeria instead of him from the company, at the end he was very tired. It was very hard work, and all the family came back. Even my mother came back. I was at the university. My sister, one sister who was with us, got married with a Greek engineer. They were already in Kenya. My other sister was in Hungary, and he was alone there. He wanted to come home, and he almost had to pray for the company that he should be substituted with somebody. And at last they found somebody in 1977, and then he could come back. I was only 4 years, because I was 1 year in the English school, then two and a half years in the German school. It was because the German school is starting in September, the English school in January, so there was a jump. And the last school year I finished in Germany, as already told you, because the German school in Lagos, where we lived, that was the capital of Nigeria then. Now they changed it. Abuja is now the capital. That's another city. In Lagos, in the German school, there was it was not a full secondary school, and that's why my father found a school, a boarding school in Germany, that I can finish my secondary school in the same school system. And that's why I lived 1 year in Germany. I didn't speak Hungarian for 1 year. So my German became so good that at the end of the year, somebody asked me, "Are you from Hamburg?" Because he felt something, in my pronunciation. But I said, "No, I came from Hungary." I didn't want to believe it.
Wow. Well, so that must have been quite a shock moving back to Hungary from a country like West Germany.
Yes, I knew, of course, I was prepared for that, because you have to know that from my childhood, when I was very small, and I was very interested in history, because my father was always reading history books and politics, and he was hearing every evening the Radio Free Europe. And I was sitting beside him, and because, the Radio Free Europe was an American radio based in Munich, and they were broadcasting in every East European language. So there was Polish, Romanian, Hungarian, Slovakian, Czech, Russian, broadcasting, Bulgarian, etc. And from there, we could really know what is happening in the world, what is happening in Hungary. Because in the Hungarian newspapers, the communist newspapers, they wrote only what they wanted. But, for example, about 1956, there were a lot of programs in the Radio Free Europe. Historical issues were also, it was not only news, there were cultural issues and history in 1956, and also from the war. And I learned history and politics sitting beside my father from Radio Free Europe. So I knew that it will be not easy. And, the 70s were still, they were not so bad as in the 50s also. You cannot compare, because the times before 1956, I think it was in Hungary the worst. It was worse than Romania under Ceausescu. It was worse than East Germany under Honecker. And in the 1970s, they were so. It was not so hard, but, if you had a different view, political view, you had no much future, no much future. And exactly in the army, it was very dangerous if you were talking free something against the regime, because there was a political officer and everybody was hearing everything, and we had you asked me before, but I was not in secondary school here, so I don't know what was in the secondary school regarding Marxism. Of course, I know because I heard that there was, for example, in every secondary school, there was a subject, the base of our worldviews. If I think maybe I can translate it like that. And this was every week, I think, one lesson, and there the children had to learn everything about Marxism, communism, and so on. This is what, fortunately, I didn't have to do because I was not in Hungary. But in the army, we had, I don't know, every 2 weeks or so, there was a lesson. We had to go in a classroom, and somebody came, a political officer or one of our officers, and it was like a school lesson, they were teaching us communism, Marxism, and so on. And in the first, nobody, we didn't hear it. It went in the left ear and went out on the right ear. But I was the only one because I was new, and in the first time I was discussing with the officer, and everybody was my friends. Because you have to know that we were together. Who went to the university, to the faculty of chemistry. All my school friends later, we were together in the army.
Oh, right. So you're all together with your friends.
Yes, that was very good because, we went to the university and we had a lot of friends. We knew each other. For the girls, it was not easy because they didn't know anybody. But, at least we knew the half of the students because the chemistry, 50% were girls, 50% were boys. And we knew each other. And so all my friends said, don't ask questions. It's useless. It's nonsense. And of course they were right, but I realized it on the first time, and then I stopped, and I never asked because there was only trouble. But I tell you what happened, because it's also a very interesting story. In Germany, I was living in the boarding school because that was a boarding school, and I had a roommate. He's a good friend. We still keep the contact, and we bought every week Der Spiegel. This German
newspaper. Yeah.
And I read every week the Spiegel. And of course, because it was interesting for me, it's a political newspaper and very good. Imagine I came home to Hungary so that for 1 year I read every week the Spiegel. And just in that year, there was a 6-page article about the Hungarian reforms. In 1968, just in the time when there was the problem in Prague, in Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, the Hungarian Communist Party invented an economical reform, which was, I have to tell you, a big thing because, of course, it was only a step in the direction of free market, but small step. But something didn't happen in Poland, in Romania, in Soviet Union. Forget about it. And it made a better life in Hungary. Really, that was a positive change, and it was not invented as it was planned because just Spring of Prague came. And Moscow didn't allow for the Hungarian Communist Party to invent the reform as it was planned, only a part of it. So the half of it was made. But even that brought a benefit for Hungary and for the people. But 1973, Brezhnev, he was very conservative. He didn't like this reform, and he ousted the leaders of this reform. So Rezső Nyers, for example, who was a member of the Politburo, and he was the economist, the leader of because it was an economical reform. Mm-hmm. He was ousted, and the Prime Minister, Jenő Fok, he was ousted, and Lajos Fehér, who were the leaders. One day, all of them, they were ousted, and the reform was turned back. Hard times came to Hungary. And about this, there was a 6-page analysis, a very interesting article in the Spiegel, in which, of course, they praised Rezső Nyers, that this was really the first attempt in the East, something new, a step in the direction of free market, and so on. And then the officer who was our boss, our officer, where I was a soldier, he was making this lesson. And he spoke about Rezső Nyers in a very bad way. He criticized him. And I didn't like that because, I was not a communist and Nyers was a communist, but he did at least something positive. So I stood up and said, look, I don't agree with you because this reform was not so bad, because that and that. And I told my arguments, which I took, of course, from the Spiegel. And then there was a discussion between us. And at the end, he said, from where do you know all this? Where do you have this information? I said, look, guys, I read an article in the Spiegel about this. And then he stopped me and he said, if the Spiegel is writing something about us, about Hungary, positive, that means that we made a big mistake. And then I said, there is no use to make any discussion with such a person. And I sat down and I didn't speak again. I didn't ask any question again when a political lesson came.
Yeah, I would imagine that it would be difficult to get a Western newspaper in Hungary, or
yes.
So how did you manage to get the newspaper on a regular basis?
That was a year before.
Oh, okay, it was the year before.
When I was in the school.
Right. Oh,
okay.
German
school, but I came home September, end of August, and September I had to go to the army, and let's say this was in October, and it was a fresh thing for me, and I remembered in Hungary it was impossible. You couldn't get only in some international hotels in Budapest, in Interconti or somewhere you could buy for dollars, maybe. But they didn't let you in as a Hungarian normal citizen. The Western tourists could buy, but in the shops you didn't get. You could get New York Times or Spiegel or anything. Only if a friend or a relative came from Western Europe and he brought newspapers with him.
Yeah. Did you still write to Andreas von Weizsäcker when you were back in Hungary, or was that too dangerous for you to do?
No, we didn't have contact. I had contact only to my my roommate and his brother, as far as I remember, and a Hungarian boy who was in the school, but he couldn't speak Hungarian. He was his name was Eric Szabo. He was 2 months old when in 1956 his parents left Hungary, and they were so angry at the communists and Hungary that they didn't teach him Hungarian. It's interesting. He asked me to teach him, and I gave him Hungarian lessons. but later, how is the story? After the 90s, he came to Hungary. He lives in Budapest somewhere now. I lost contact with him, but he lives in Hungary, and he learned Hungarian properly. But that time he couldn't speak Hungarian. So with such people, with Weizsäcker, I didn't keep the contact. Once we almost visited him because I was in Germany. I visited my friend in Regensburg, who was my roommate, and 400 kilometers away, there was an exhibition because he became an artist, He died, unfortunately, I think 6 or 7 years ago. He had cancer and he became an artist. And he had an exhibition, and we wanted to go to the opening ceremony to meet him. But at last, I don't know, something happened and we didn't go because it was too far or something. And so that's why I didn't meet him again. But he was a very good football player, And we played together football. And there was a competition in the school that every class had a team. And it was a competition. And we won the competition. And I shot the most goals because Weizsäcker gave me so good balls. He was a very good midfield player, and it's very interesting, because all the Germans wanted to play midfield or libero because Franz Beckenbauer was the big star, He was really one of the best football players, a German. And, he was the idol and everybody wanted to play in his position and nobody wanted to be a striker. But, the Hungarians are individualists, and we had a Ferenc Puskás, who was the greatest football player of the world in the 50s. And he was a front player, a striker who was shooting the goal. And all Hungarians, they always wanted to be strikers. Nobody wanted to be a defender. It's very interesting. But the Germans, they all wanted to play in the back as Beckenbauer, and he also. And I was alone in front. And they gave me so good balls, especially Weizsäcker, that I shot most of the goals, and we won the competition. So it's only a story.
No, that's a good. Those stories are great. I like those. I like those stories. Well, that's it for today's episode. We'll be returning to László's story as he becomes more involved in Hungary's democracy movement, so stay tuned for that one. Don't forget to visit the show notes at coldwarconversations.com, where there's details of books with more background about Hungary and links to some videos as well. If you can't wait for the next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group, where our guests and listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. We're also on Twitter at Cold War Pod and Instagram at Cold War Conversations. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.